I don't know. I mean, what I can say is the first book I did and the first big exhibition I did on American architecture was called Weekend Utopia, and it's done pretty well as a book over the years. And that was really mid-century. I mean, it's almost become nauseatingly, repetitive. This lust for mid-century modernism, which I fell in love with in the 70s and 80s when it was this postmodern period, and all of that was being torn down and kind of trashed. And it just looked really good. And to me, my parents had this beach house in the Hamptons, tiny little thing on the dune that a guy from MIT who had actually gone to the Bauhaus designed. I mean, he designed it as a kit of parts almost, like a prefab. And it was just the coolest house. It was tiny, but everybody had their little space. And we slept in bunk beds and everything. And to me, that was the ideal. And everybody, this postmodern period, neo-regionalism or neo-kind of formalism, neo-traditionalism. And it was like so phony. And everybody was trying to be like English gentry, with these rambling houses. And to me, it was like I wanted to evoke this period in the 50s and 60s and early 70s when, you just built this tiny little simple house, tiny imprint on the land, leave the land the way it is. And floor-to-ceiling glass, and very modern, and that seemed to be an ideal. Then I realized there was this whole world of forgotten work, and forgotten architects. So that led me to really a career, funnily enough. And I did a lot of shows and a lot of books about that period. I'm not saying it's the very high point of American architecture, but I think all these GIs were coming back after World War II. And there was this huge, it was the Eames, it was Paul Rudolph, Philip Johnson even, who was, had been in the Nazi party, Charles Stone. These guys were just exploding with ideas. And I think it was the way painting in the Hamptons and Provincetown, exploded after World War II. And suddenly America, New York, the Hamptons, P-Town became the new center, the new vortex of art instead of Paris. The same thing happened in architecture in a lot of ways. I think I've told you the story about Peter Blake. He'd gotten out of Germany. He was in London for a few years. He came to New York, and the first thing he did when he came to the East Hampton was he visited Jackson Pollock. He went into Pollock's studio and was just blown away. And he said, "This is the future. We are so out of it. This guy is like on a whole other planet." And he said, how do we as architects, as urban planners and architects, how do we do this level of all over sort of reversing the whole scale, reversing the orientation, the way Pollock would put his canvas down on the floor and work on it almost like he was a native dancer, doing this incredible ritual. And Peter saw all of that right away. The minute he walked into Pollock's studio, saw that to me was a huge inspiration. When I did Weekend Utopia and about 3 other books about that period, and I call one of the shows I did was called Convergence, because it was the artists and the architects and the writers and the architects. The architects, the painters, the sculptors, the poets, the musicians were all kind of working towards a similar convergence of all this. It was about space. It was very spatial, and it was about very much an American space, not in a sentimental, romantic sense of the Wild West, but just this sense of space and enclosure and personal movement that was very different than the European models.